Hi there, my name is Tim Baird. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Geography, and I'm happy to be presenting with my colleague today.
I'm Eranga Galapatti, the faculty member for Department of Geography, Virginia Tech.
And he and I are going to be sharing some stories about our backgrounds and our experience working with Indigenous people and an aspect of Indigenous lives that's really relevant for sustainability. As a way of an introduction, I think it's maybe useful for us to share a tiny bit about our backgrounds so that you have some sense of where we came from and how we came to be speaking to you.
I have a background in fisheries and aquaculture. I started my journey as a shrimp farmer from rural Sri Lanka.
I grew up in a small town in central Maine. It had a paper mill on a river, and most of my friends' parents worked at the paper mill. I studied economics. I did the audacious thing of buying a ticket to Kenya and traveling around East and Southern Africa for a number of months. And then I went back to graduate school. Ultimately, I did my doctoral work in some Maasai communities in Tanzania. Maasai are an ethnic group, and they're also an indigenous group in Tanzania. I am excited to share with you a bit about how they live and how their lives can help us to better understand some of the challenges that sustainability involves. What do we mean? Let me back up. First, I want to tackle this question of indigeneity.
Who are indigenous peoples? There's no universally agreed upon definition of indigenous peoples.
A definition that you could find if you just search this online is that indigenous peoples are culturally distinct communities who are the original inhabitants of a particular region with ancestral ties to the land that predate colonization or the formation of modern nation states.
The concept emerged because of European colonization, which led to marginalization of original inhabitants in various parts of the world.
They maintain unique cultural traditions, languages, knowledge systems, and social institutions, and often have ongoing spiritual, economic, and political relationships with their traditional territories. So this is a definition. If you ask some search engine, you'll get something like this.
In 1997, after years of debate, the United Nations Working Group on Indigenous Populations concluded they could not offer a universal definition. Instead, it was agreed indigenous peoples could define themselves.
This is a book I use in my class called Conservation Refugees. He starts this section by saying, this is a tough one. The central issue for indigenous peoples is recognition. And recognition depends partly on the definition of indigeneity. There is no legal definition of indigenous peoples.
But we have working definitions. The organizations like World Bank, United Nations, they use those type of definitions. Some of the commonly recognized characteristics include self-identification, self-determination, cultural integrity and distinct social, economic, and political systems, collective attachment to the place, and indigenous language and their own knowledge systems.
The International Work Group for Indigenous Affairs rejects all definitions. Their official statement on the matter reads, "We assert our inherent right to define who we are. We do not approve any other definition."
Here are some key facts about indigenous peoples. A significant portion of the world's remaining biodiversity is found within indigenous territories. Sustainability lies at the heart of indigenous food and knowledge systems, some of the oldest and most resilient on the earth. Indigenous food systems are grounded in deep intergenerational knowledge, and they have profound respect for local ecosystems.
There are a lot of misconceptions with indigenous groups. Importantly, that they are kind of fixed in time and they don't change. And they live exactly the way that they lived decades ago or hundreds of years ago or longer. And that's just not true. I think a central point that we can make is that indigeneity needs to be understood within its context. It's there that we can sketch the contours of indigeneity. So I'm going to share a context where I study a group of people, and Dr. Galapathy is going to do the same.
My current work focuses on integrating climate change and food security considerations among Indigenous peoples in Sri Lanka, which we call Vadda, and the Canadian Arctic, we call Inuit people. I have ongoing collaboration with these communities using a community-based participatory approach. Through this work, I aim to understand how these communities experience environmental changes, such as climate change, and how they respond to such changes. This includes examining how both Vadda and Inuit communities interact with common pool natural resources such as fisheries, forestry, and aquaculture. To illustrate these concepts, I will share a personal example from my background as a shrimp farmer in northwestern Sri Lanka. Shrimp farming in Sri Lanka is generally a small scale and family owned. As farmers, we rely on shared lagoon water system to raise our shrimp. So we usually raise tiger shrimps called Penes monadan. So this lagoon serves as a commons in this context. So there are three main lagoons in this area. All these three lagoon water bodies interconnected by a canal called Dutch Canal. The challenge here is that all shrimp farmers are connected to this shared water body to use it to both withdrawal of clean water and discharge used, often pollutant water, which may contain shrimp disease. To address this shared challenge, we self-organized into community-based shrimp farming associations and implemented a zonal crop calendar systems. We divided the interconnected lagoon area into 5 zones and several sub-zones, coordinating water use and discharge in a way that created buffer zone areas. This helped minimize the spread of diseases throughout the lagoon system. The zonal crop calendar system allowed us to tackle 2 classic commons challenges, which called excludability and subtractability or rivalry. Excludability refers to controlling access to the resources. Subtractability, or sometimes called rivalry, is about one person's use of resources can diminish its availability to others.
You know, an important step here is that what I'm about to discuss, I experience from the position that I come from. I'm a white man, I'm middle-aged, and I grew up in kind of a rural part of a New England state. When I travel around the world, I bring my lived experiences, and they shape what I see. The questions that I'm interested in aren't necessarily the questions that other people are interested in. So that's part of my positionality. When I talk about Indigenous people and I talk about their lives, I'm of course discussing these things from my own perspective. For my research, I work with a group of pastoralists in East Africa. The Maasai people can be found in southern Kenya and in northern Tanzania. And a key aspect of Maasai lives is common property. Maasai for generations have herded livestock, as I mentioned, and that means they need a shared grazing area. And that we can say is a common pool resource. Common property regimes are management strategies for groups who share a common pool resource. And it involves limits on how much of the resource people can take and when they can take it. And it includes strategies to monitor how users use the resource. And it includes sanctions for people who abuse the resource. I think it's important to point out here that common property regimes are ways in which many indigenous groups sustain natural resources. Tragedies of the commons occur in the absence of common property regimes or when common property regimes are weak. So as agriculture has expanded, the size of the common pool resource has shrunk. And you could say, why have the Maasai adopted agriculture? And I'll tell you, because they're concerned about conservation. They're concerned that as governments expand protected areas, that people who are using the land to live on will be pushed off that land, and they will be compensated for privately held land that has been improved, like a farm. Households feel like an insurance policy against the expansion of conservation in the form of national parks is to privatize some of the land and develop it and cultivate it. It is an insurance policy against the expansion of conservation. It's also important to point out here that in some cases, conservation is unjust, and it has the effect of motivating people to make decisions that undermine conservation. So, what can Indigenous perspectives teach us about sustainability? Common property is an important idea in sustainability. We can think of our waterways as common property. We can think of our atmosphere as common property. We can think of our oceans as common property. We can think of our national parks as common property. So in some cases, we can see that these things have been improved through protection. In other cases, we can see that protection has produced unjust outcomes for Indigenous groups. And it can help us to see how, with sustainability, we can try to change one thing and make it better. But things are connected to each other. And if we're not careful, in trying to change one thing, we can change other things we weren't expecting to change. Indigenous groups live, in many cases, on marginalized land. I think another concern for sustainability is that Indigenous groups disproportionately face some of the consequences of climate change in these marginal areas. So to close, we have a few questions for you to reflect on. Where do you see the commons in your own life? I've given a couple of examples, but what about common pool resources that are much closer to home in your day-to-day lives? We could think of the library or your dorm. What are other types of shared public space? Where do you encounter Indigenous representation in pop culture or in policy? What assumptions do you have about Indigenous people? And have those shifted as a result of this video? If so, how? And last, can you think of modern examples of the tragedy of the commons?